Hello, I'm Penny Thornton and I'm talking astrology. On this particular video, I'm going to be talking about the forthcoming solar eclipse, the way the planet Pluto is squaring it, is connecting with it, and what it may mean really in terms of international, national events and going back in time as well and looking at what happened before. And of course, because the forthcoming solar eclipse, 20th of April, falls just before King Charles's coronation. In fact, his coronation occurs on the lunar eclipse 2 weeks later. There is a real relevance to this big event in the life of the monarchy, the British monarchy, and we're certainly going to be focusing on that because it brings up such a lot of very interesting things about families and dynasties and destinies. And I wanted to get into that before the great event itself. So one thing I want to say about what we're working through at the moment, what's going on. Pluto went into Aquarius on the 23rd of March, and by that time was already beginning to square the nodal axis. And it's going to continue to do that, but at the time of the solar eclipse on the 20th of April, it's going to be very, very close indeed. And that's why the closer we get to the nodal axis and the eclipse date, and Pluto is in there as well, this is what all the fuss is about. Now, other astrologers have looked at this, and psychics, mystics are all looking at this period of time, and not only suggesting that it's a very, very important time for humanity, but also considering what may be going on, especially in regard to King Charles. And so I'm going to be joining those ranks. But the first thing I want to say is that there is a kind of movement that's talking about this particular setup with Pluto squaring the nodal axis, that this is a time when there's a huge kind of energy shift, and that portals and pathways will open, and we can look at that in terms of our own spiritual growth and our own consciousness, expansion of consciousness. Be that as it may, and that's fine. But of course, this isn't the first time that we've had Pluto squaring the nodal axis, or indeed in contact with the nodal axis. So this is not a once in a kind of century event, although of course we've got, the nodal axis on a different axis, we've got Pluto in a different sign, so it's unique in its own way. But the very fact that Pluto is squaring the nodal axis is not a unique event, and I'm going to be taking us back there in a moment just to see why. So another point that I want to make is that on this particular video, I will be looking at the general portents for all of this. What does it mean? What is it all about? Whereas in my next video, I'm going to be talking about it as regards who you are, sign by sign. So we've got a kind of dual way of looking at this. We're looking out on the world and humanity, and where is all this going, and what does it mean? And then we'll do a little bit more individually on a separate video. So first I need to talk about the nodes. What is the North Node? What is the South Node? What's the nodal axis? Well, it's not a planet. The North Node and the South Node aren't planets, although in Vedic astrology, they do have a planetary signature, Rahu and Ketu, and they do have different functions. In Western astrology, we're looking at the nodal axis being a very important axis, both in a natal chart and as it develops, going, day by day, what is the nodal axis doing? And it is the point at which the path of the moon intersects with the path of the sun. And that's where the nodes meet. That's where eclipses are formed. And eclipses are very, very powerful things. If we go back thousands of years to the Babylonian astrologers, they were keen on looking at the astronomy of the piece, at precise calculations. And they noticed not only how eclipses, they were able to predict eclipses by looking at the patterns of the moon intersecting, the moon's path intersecting with the Earth's path, so to speak. But of course, as far as predictions went, eclipses were always harbingers of very important, fateful things. They predicted, or they were thought to forecast, the birth of a king, the death of a king, the coronation of a king, or the onset of plague, pestilences, wars, all of those kind of things. And I have to say that thousands of years along the line, we astrologers still take eclipses very seriously. And we do consider them to be fateful, that around that time, events have a fateful, destined quality about them. I often say that eclipses are game changers. They change the nature of things. So we're going to be looking at that sort of shortly. In brief again, when we look at this nodal axis and we look at what the north node means in your natal chart and the south node means, we look to the north node as being part of our current destiny. And we are making and meeting our destiny in the north node, whereas the south node is where we've been, where we've got the t-shirt and we're coming from. And in some cases, that's a bit of a refuge. We like to slip back into our south node. It's kind of familiar, whether it was familiar because, even if it wasn't very good for us, it's familiar. So really our focus in the life that we're in really needs to be on meeting destined events, which are characterized by our north node, its sign, its position in the horoscope, and with a reference to where we've come from. So again, we get this idea of fate and karma and destiny being very tied up with the nodal axis in a natal chart and in a chart of anything you wish to put, wish to erect a chart for. But also we're looking at the fact that this is where eclipses take place, and therefore we need to look at pretty important global events, national events, and of course, events in our own life too. Now, it takes about 18.6 years for the nodes to do a complete revolution of the zodiac, about 18 months in each sign of the zodiac. So at the moment, the north node is in Taurus and it's moving backwards into Aries. It hasn't been there for 18.6 years. So you could look back in your own life and see if that has any significance in your life. Because a nodal return, which is what it is, if you've got the nodes coming back to where they were originally in your natal chart, it tends to show an 18-month period of very, very significant destined developments. So as it moves back through Taurus, by the time it comes to April, we're at the very, very beginnings of Aries. It's going to slip back very shortly into Aries in July, but it's in Taurus at the time that we're talking, and that's why it has a relevance to Pluto, which is 90 degrees away from those early Taurus degrees. So let me talk about when it happened before, because if we have a reference to the past, it can give us some idea of what to expect this time around. And I want to take you back to 2014. Now, you may remember 2014, it wasn't after all that long ago, but just to give you an idea, which of course is relevant to our time now, and that was because Putin invaded Crimea and annexed it in 2014. That actually occurred in the February and March of the year, and the eclipse we're interested in is the October of that year. So I'm going to show you the chart now, and so that we can have a look at what that actually looked like. So as you can see from this particular chart, which I have set up for New York, it's arbitrary. I set up my charts for all different places in the world, so you all get a chance to see things. And of course, if you were in New York at that time, you might have all sorts of reasons to think, oh my goodness, October that year was terribly significant for me. So what we're looking at here is the North Node, that's that little omega symbol at the kind of 9 o'clock position in the chart. And opposite, we find at the opposite point in the 7th house of the horoscope, we have the Omega sign reversed, because that is the south node, north node, south node, nodal axis. And as we can see, the sun above the north node is at 15 degrees of Libra, so it's on that eclipse point. And opposite the sun is the moon, of course, at around 15:05 minutes. So that is the moment of the lunar eclipse on October the 8th, 2014. And you can see, if you look at the very base of the chart, you can see Pluto. You can see that it's intersecting the sun and Uranus. Oh, well, actually, I haven't introduced Uranus yet, but that's part of the mix. But the sun and moon, the lunar eclipse, is intersected by Pluto. Pluto is squaring it. So that we can see here that this isn't the first time Pluto has squared the nodal axis. It has done so in October 2014. But let's have a look at the events around that time, which are pretty significant. The first 8 days of October included a gunpowder plant exploding in Bulgaria. 83 million accounts were compromised in financial companies, including JP Morgan. What we also found in those first 8 days was ISIS surrounded the city of Kobani in Syria, and that inspired 130,000 people to flee. Last but not least, and may also be significant, is that a Scottish nurse was diagnosed with Ebola, and that began a huge scare of a forthcoming pandemic, which was very scary indeed. She'd been working in West Africa and had brought the virus over with her. And you may remember, I certainly do, because I was traveling at that time, there were all sorts of precautions in play to make sure that nobody was going to transmit the virus. So that was just in those 8 days surrounding the lunar eclipse. Now, if we come back to me. See, I have my glasses on and I'm looking at charts so I don't make a blunder anymore. So if we come to the next time Pluto was involved with a solar eclipse, we're going to be looking at the 11th of January, 2020. So let's have a look at that in terms of our horoscope. So you'll easily remember January of 2020. It was only 3 and a bit years ago. And of course, here we go. Let's have a look at where the nodal axis is on this occasion. We can see that the south node is in Capricorn. We can see the north node is in Cancer. So at that particular time, a lunar eclipse on the 11th of January, the sun was in Capricorn and the moon was conjoined, was in the region of the north node on that particular day. Now, where was Pluto? Well, if you look at the bottom sort of 8 o'clock position of this horoscopic circle, you'll see the symbol for Pluto, which is like a kind of tuning fork, but instead of another fork like Neptune, it's got a circle. So that is Pluto. And we can see by looking at the numbers, Sun, Mercury, Saturn, Pluto, all of these planets were bunched up together, and Jupiter is far outside there as well. So we have a solar eclipse conjunct Saturn, Pluto. Now that was very significant because, of course, we all remember what happened in 2020. This was the rise of COVID-19. This is when it was starting to become a problem. And if you remember in 2014, we were also looking at the threat Ebola posed for us. Didn't actually manifest, but it was in the atmosphere, so to speak. So on this occasion, not only do we have the start of what proved to be the most difficult and deadly time in almost a century, we're also looking at other events of that time. And you may remember that this was the time Harry and Meghan made their announcement that they were leaving, they were giving up their royal duties and moving to America. And of course, as you know, this situation has definitely developed. And this in turn has had a very, very big effect on the monarchy. and was no surprise because, in fact, in terms of the charts of the time, remember, our late queen was sitting on the throne at that time, and this Saturn-Pluto conjunction was in force in her horoscope. And through that, we can see that the reverberations from this move of Harry and Meghan were to go on and continue to make quite a devastating effect on the monarchy. So that's another reference. We're looking at Pluto in reference to the nodal axis, and we're looking back at 2020. And also, of course, Saturn-Pluto conjunction. It's the first time that had happened in over 30 years. And that was also a year of which, many different kind of factors of global importance started to happen. I talked about this back in 2019, 2020, and I looked at this particularly in reference to Putin. And I had also looked back at 2014 and Crimea, and I thought to myself, my goodness, Putin is going to make another move, because when we're looking at Pluto aspects, we're looking at reformation, often to do with territory and land. Now, who knows? Did COVID-19 interfere with his plans? Because, he only went in the February of 2022, although he was building up his troops throughout 2021. So these are significant because we're again going to be looking at, and let's now, I will come back to me again, I'm going to take my glasses off, but now I want to have a look at the current solar eclipse, and we can see where we are in terms of where Pluto is on this one as well. So let's come to the chart here and have a look at this. Now, as you can see, this is, in my book, the Astrology Handbook and the Art of Interpretation, I make a really, really big thing about the shaping, what grouping and shaping the planets are forming, because this has a real bearing on destiny, in our natal charts. It shows certain characteristics. And on this particular chart, we can see all these planets bunched together. On this occasion, I've actually chosen London for where to erect the chart from. And in part, this is to do with the fact that obviously it's only a couple of weeks away from the coronation. And I wanted to sort of see just how the land lay, in terms of a horoscope. So we've actually created a horoscope for the moment of the eclipse here. And you'll see in that 8 o'clock position again, the sun and moon together at 29 of Aries, 49-50 minutes. And what you'll also see is Jupiter quite close to that conjunction. And as we go forward, we can see where the north node is. And we can also see that Mercury and Uranus are very close in the sky, so to speak. So they're having an influence to bear on this particular solar eclipse. And they're high on most elevated planets, the one closest to the midheaven. We can see Pluto at 0 degrees of Aquarius 20. So the eclipse may be at 29 degrees, 50 minutes of Aries, but literally within hours, the sun moves to 0 degrees of Taurus and precisely squares Pluto. So this is a very, very tight configuration. And to come back to the idea of groupings and shapings in a chart being very important, we can see really that this cluster of planets is exerting a kind of effect of a concentration of energies. Let's look at it that way. Everything is tightly bunched up together in the signs of Aries and Taurus, so we have a very concentrated effect. So events at this time are likely to be pretty intense. This is by no means a light-hearted period of the year by any stretch of the imagination. It's going to be really, really intense, profound, as I've just said. And because of the connection, as we could see here with Mercury and Uranus, then we look as though we're going to see some pretty explosive events at this time. Now, in general terms, and I've done a lot of work on eclipses and full moons, new moons. And if you'd like the article I wrote about this, please get in touch because I'll send it to you. There's also some reference in my Friday Bites where I've had a look at the recent earthquake in Turkey, which followed a similar kind of pattern, that often we find the signature of an eclipse on an earthquake, or we find an eclipse happening in the region of time around an eclipse. So let me just come back to the idea of the signature of the eclipse. In this particular case, we know this eclipse is 29 Aries, 0 degrees Taurus, so that if a future earthquake were to happen, or something of that nature, even if it wasn't on the day of the eclipse, it would have 29 Aries, 0 degrees Taurus. It would have that neck of the woods imprinted on the chart, whether it was the rising degree of that event or the culminating degree of that event. That's what I mean about the signature of eclipses being on events. But of course, we also need to look at these stresses and strains that may be or may be not apparent. Again, there is not a lot of scientific evidence for the idea that earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis, other kind of upheavals that are related to the Earth have anything to do with the planets. That's hotly refuted by scientists. But certainly there is a pattern here that I have certainly looked at and feel is interesting, and you might like to want to do the same and see around this particular time. And let's also remember that the timeline of an eclipse is a little elastic. So although we've got this pinpoint of the 20th of April, we can go back a couple of weeks, we can go forward a couple of weeks. Of course, then we've got a lunar eclipse, but we go forward again, perhaps to the middle of May. So this whole period is ripe for kind of explosive developments. And I think that's a good word to use because we don't necessarily have to have fireworks and earth movements and, disasters and, big conflicts. But we can have that happen with events that prove to be controversial and explosive. So I'd like us to kind of stick with that. Is there, when we look at this solar eclipse in reference to Great Britain, we're looking at London, the capital, is it significant that Neptune is rising in this chart so it becomes all dominant? Well, maybe it is. We'll have to test this one out. And Neptune is the planet of mystery, of chaos, of confusion, of the divine realm. So it has to do with dreams. And also there's a filmic quality to Neptune. So things to do with glamour, the film business, those kind of extraordinary developments of which you could say the coronation typifies. It is a moment of deep spiritual, it's a deeply spiritual event for the monarch. The anointing of the monarch under that canopy is a very, very spiritual event. And we know that Her Majesty, Queen, our late Majesty, took that incredibly deeply, that she had made a covenant with God as she was anointed. And she was an extremely religious person. And we sort of see this imprinted at the time, sort of, all right, we're using a bit of poetic license, but it plays into the quality of the time, that there is a strong spiritual, don't want to use that word energy, but let's throw it in there. It's in there. And we are just 2 weeks from the coronation, so it definitely applies. What I also want you to look at in this chart is the proximity of Chiron to Jupiter, of Jupiter to the solar eclipse, and on through to the Mercury-Uranus conjunction in Taurus. Chiron, of course, is not a planet. It's a centaur object, but we have taken it into our solar system family, because Chiron does come into our solar system. It passes by Saturn and comes out in the orbit of Uranus. It's called a Saturn-Uranus object. So the fact that Chiron is in Aries, coming to this conjunction of Jupiter and the solar eclipse, we could see that there's a huge amount of pain involved in this. Now, does it mean that the painful experiences of the time are part of a big journey into healing? We could say that. I quite like that interpretation. But we can also look at the fact that the events of this time are lessons. There's something on our journey that we make through the pain of being a human being, through the pain of being, a member of humanity, is alive and well and brought into the events of the eclipse at this time. So let's come back to me again. And I want to bring us a little bit more up to date at the moment, because not only are astrologers and those of us in various disciplines, mystical disciplines, you might say, talking about the forthcoming events being of mighty importance. We're also looking at astrologers who've talked about the coronation and suggested that the coronation may not actually take place. And I want to show you and explain where this is coming from. Now, we have to, I'm going to show you the chart of the coronation as it is set at the moment, and that will give us a little bit more of an insight into why there is a certain amount of concern about this forthcoming event. But I want to take us back in time to when King Charles was born, and there were some very important astrologers of the time did express some concern about the chart, deeming it not to be particularly kingly. In fact, Charles Carter, very famous astrologer of the time, was subtle in his way. He talked about this chart, said it was a very pleasant chart of King Charles, well, Prince Charles as he was then, but that it lacked definition or indications of kingship, simply because Jupiter was not in a very strong position. And we do look at Jupiter to be in a significant position in the chart of our monarchs, and it almost always is. And if we take William, for instance, he's got Jupiter on his midheaven, so we're pretty sure that William is going to take the throne. We don't have to worry really about William, but we're a little bit more worried about Charles because things are a little bit more subtle in his chart. So it was for that very reason that people began to think, oh, not so sure about whether, this is, he's going to take the throne. I came across this when I was working on my book, Suns and Lovers, and that's Suns, S-U-N-S, which became Romancing the Stars in its paperback edition. And I had taken the then Prince Charles as one of my studies to examine his chart. And I did throw out the fact that there was a question mark over his taking the throne, but not for me was Jupiter the reason. For me, it was Neptune and the position of Neptune, because Neptune is so coincident with sacrifice, giving things up, not meeting the obligation, that I thought that this may be an indication of something to watch. Well, let's come up to date, and we already know that Charles is king, but he has not yet been crowned. And so this is why there are still some question marks hovering over this date. And I will come back to look at Charles's chart, but for now, I want to take a look at the coronation. So let's have a look at what this chart looks like and why there's such a fuss about it. So as you'll see here, I've set the chart for 11 o'clock in the morning. Now, we do not know, or at least I do not know at this point in time, the 19th of March, whether or not 11 o'clock is the time of the start of the coronation, which of course is what all astrologers look at, because the beginning of an event is the birth of the event. So we do know that it's going to be in the morning, but I mean, it could be, and do you know, I suspect it wouldn't be at 10 o'clock in the morning. I do think it's probably going to be a little bit later. And in fact, Her Late Majesty the coronation began at 11:15 at her coronation. So there are sort of thoughts that it's going to be somewhere between 11:15 and 11:30. So I set it for 11 o'clock, arbitrary, and we can sort of see how all these planets fit into this circle. Now, I want to point initially to the ascendant, which is in the 9 o'clock position in this chart, and that's at 6 Leo 32. And this is Prince Charles ascendant, or King Charles ascendant, very near to it, and we'll come back and look at that. So to me, this time is probably a good one, although if it's set for 11:15 or 11:30, we're still in an important region of the chart. Leo is taking a while to come over the ascendant, so we're not moving a huge distance forward. And Charles has his Pluto at 16 degrees of Leo, so the ascendant is moving towards Pluto, and that's got a significance all of its own anyway. But yes, why is this chart so controversial? Well, let's have a look at the sun up there in the almost 12 o'clock position, and we can see it's at 15 Taurus 38, and that is the degree, perhaps a little bit earlier than that, of the lunar eclipse the day before. The lunar eclipse at almost 15 degrees Taurus Scorpio. By the time we come to the coronation itself, on the morning of the coronation, the moon has moved forward from its eclipse position, but we are in the embrace of that eclipse. And it has now come to 24 of Scorpio. And that is within a couple of degrees of Charles's sun at 22x minutes of Scorpio, as we'll see that later. So it's of huge significance. We know that this chart really signifies an event of importance for King Charles, and of course it is his coronation. But what we're also looking at here is the fact that the sun is up close and personal to Uranus. And a Sun-Uranus conjunction is all about the unexpected, the unusual, the controversial. So we know by looking at this that there is controversy surrounding this event. Now, if we're just looking at the event as it goes ahead, we can be absolutely sure there's going to be demonstrations, upsets, and of course, within the family itself, the whole business with Meghan and Harry is going to be controversial. So this is imprinted in the chart of the coronation. We're also looking at something else here. Next to the sun is planet Mercury, 8 degrees of Taurus. Now, Mercury is retrograde. It went retrograde the day after the solar eclipse. So to have the eclipses during a period when Mercury is retrograde is also an amber light. It says, what's happening here? Are we going back into the past? Is the past repeating itself? Do we have to look at the past to find out why events are happening in the way they are happening now at this point in time? So I'm going to come around to that shortly. But there are alarm bells with this particular chart. Now, I've heard different versions here. Someone has mentioned the fact that this date was handpicked because of its astrological significance. And you would say, as you heard me mention a little bit earlier, the idea that eclipses are very important markers of global and national importance. So, you know, the birth of kings, the deaths of kings, the onset of war, all of those kind of things, eclipses figure into the story. So it would make a certain sense if you were designing a chart for a coronation that you might think an eclipse should be in there because this is such an important destined moment. I mean, in terms of destiny, Charles will be fulfilling his destiny to be king at this coronation. So it would make a certain sense that you've got an eclipse. However, that eclipse is up close and personal to Uranus. Would you really choose to have Uranus involved, which says this is a very short-lived thing? You know, is the coronation itself kind of short? It's cut short. So it's not like the long coronations of old. Or is it that things to do with the reign itself? And remember, this coronation, this crowning of Charles sets in motion the Carolean reign. So we are looking at a Sun-Uranus conjunction here. Does that mean it's kind of short? Does it mean that it's controversial, his reign? Does it mean that there are enormous amount of breakthroughs and things done very differently during the course of his reign, that the march of progress goes on, sometimes in quite shocking ways? Or is his reign also peppered with controversy and conflict? We've got all these things to surmise. So not exactly the pick you might have to crown a future king. What we can see, importantly, is that there is an elevated Jupiter. Jupiter is in the 10th house. That's important. We want to see Jupiter in pride of place, showing that this is a great and important historical event. But guess what? It's Chiron that is near the midheaven. Just as we saw Chiron in the chart of the solar eclipse, it's telling us this is a learning experience. This is something we're being taught. This is going to be something that's going to cause us a wound. Or is it the opportunity for wounds to be healed? I love that interpretation. And again, if we come back to controversy and coronations, you know, the wounds that have been caused by the rift between William and Harry, Charles and Harry, Meghan, Kate, the whole of that group of senior royals. Is this an opportunity that Chiron presents for healing? Maybe it is. I hope it is. But it's also saying that maybe the wounds go deeper. The wounds are likely to, be something that will continue on through the reign of King Charles, the Carolean reign. Now, there's something else I wanted to say here that I think is important. Maybe we'll look at, King Charles's chart that will bring this into light. I like to, come back to me just to give some chopping and changing to do with looking at charts and then coming back to the conversation as such. This idea that the coronation may not happen, obviously we're not going to be able to see that in the chart of the coronation, because if the coronation goes ahead, that's it, that's what we're stuck with. So we're looking at that. Is the coronation in doubt? Well, there are plenty of astrological reasons to say, this is a time of great uncertainty. And we've seen that in the chart of the solar eclipse, where we saw all that grouping of planets and again in square to Pluto. The times that we're living in are full of controversy and conflict. And going back, when I looked at the 2020 chart of the eclipse and the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, in my mind, this was important for Putin. And we may be seeing some important developments at this time of the eclipse squaring Pluto with the war in Ukraine. And let's leave it open. But I would suspect, and Putin is a very Plutonic individual. He's got Scorpio rising, and there's all sorts of he's got Pluto on the midheaven. So we know that Pluto is a significant player in on his astrological stage. So something like an eclipse squaring Pluto is going to make for big developments regarding Putin. Let's leave it open. We have to get there, but we should be looking out at that. And of course, we've already looked at the idea of kind of nature, things that happen to do naturally with things, or we could be looking at conflicts spreading, or even other things that aren't terribly pleasant to consider around this time. And so if that is the climate of the time, so to speak, there could be enough evidence in that to say, there is perhaps concern that the coronation might have to be postponed. This is not the first time a coronation would have to be postponed, incidentally. Edward VII, back in 1902, the coronation was set for June the 26th, but the future king, well, he was king, but not crowned, developed an appendicitis, and coronation had to be postponed, an operation performed, and that was a really scary thing in those days. Modern surgery isn't where it is today, back at the turn of the 20th century. So there was a great amount of risk and concern that they might lose the king. And of course, there'd been an eclipse before that date, ironically, on May the 7th. And in other words, that eclipse was exactly the same as the one we've got now. It was on the same degree of Taurus. So the coronation was postponed to August the 9th of that year. And of course, as we know, it was a great event. And King Edward VII, he reigned for, I think, about 8 more years. So it's not the end of the world if something has to be postponed. So I'm setting the stage here for why there's cause for concern, and why we may want to explore the astrology and try to understand where astrologers are coming from. So now I want to have a look at King Charles, at his chart, and to go back and sort of have a look at who he is at this great momentous period of his life. Now, in history, of course, I've mentioned the idea of Charles Carter, who did sort of say it was a nice, easy chart, but he didn't think it was particularly kingly. And the position of Jupiter, in this case, Jupiter in this sort of 4-5 o'clock position at 29 degrees of Sagittarius, is almost into the 6th house. And the 6th house is known as a cadent house. A lot of processing and tying up goes on in that house. So it wasn't considered to be a very strong Jupiter. Plus, Jupiter was opposed to Uranus. And so that is also a consideration of, is this going to be a brief reign? Is this going to be a brief life even? There's all sorts of things wound up into that. But for my, where I was coming from was the position of Neptune, as you can see, Neptune close to the IC, Neptune at 14 degrees of Libra in that sort of 7 o'clock position as you look at the chart, close to the IC at 1316. Now, what is significant here about Charles? And I should say a little bit about Charles the man, because we've had 70 odd years to get to know Charles, King Charles, and we know that he is a very, very worthy man. He was out of his time, really. His interest in the ecology and organic foods and architecture, all of which was sort of poked fun at the time. He's now become a man of the time, because this is what we're all concerned with. And if we look at that rising Pluto in his chart, notice 5 degrees Leo, 23 is his ascendant, Pluto at 16 of Leo, we can see that he would be very, very concerned with the transformation of the land, of all of the sorts of things that he's got involved with are to do with his great desire to be a transformer. He feels he's come into the world to be a transformer. And of course, as we can see at this point in time, you remember the chart of the coronation, we can see that Pluto, his natal Pluto, is very close to the rising degree, whatever time the coronation occurs. But what we also want to look at in Charles's chart is that elevated moon in Taurus. We go right to the top of the chart, the 10th house, 0 degrees of Taurus, 26. that moon is elevated. And the moon is not only to do with emotions, feeling, childhood, family. It's all of those things, of course, but depending where it is in a chart, the properties of the moon are also brought into play in the life of the person, in this case of Charles. Now, a lot of writers have the moon in the 10th house. A lot of artists have the moon in the 10th house. And we know also that Charles is an artist. He's a writer. These things to him are an important part of who he is. And we see that elevated moon there. And not only that, but that elevated moon is in a grand trine, which is a configuration of great harmony. We have the moon trine Saturn, trine Jupiter, trine the moon. So actually in this trine, bringing together these different planets, Jupiter, Saturn, and the moon, is suggestive of a life fulfilled and of responsibility and position taken. So I would kind of disagree a little bit with Charles Carter on the position of Jupiter, because I think bound up in this grand trine, it is of significance. But let's come back again one other thing I want to point out, and that's the sun at 22 degrees of Scorpio. Now, another astrologer, the late Roger Elliott, who wrote a book about royalty, and he wrote a book about royalty in 1977. So Charles was very young. Prince Charles was a young man then. And he referred to this idea that astrologers have pointed out he might not become king. And he felt quite the reverse. He thought that the fact that the sun at 22 degrees of Scorpio connected with the late Queen's midheaven and also the moon of his late grandfather, the father of the Queen, meant that the line was continued. He saw that as very, very strong evidence of kingship. And 22 degrees of Scorpio, that does figure with all key members of the royal family, and we would expect to see that, or around that degree, anywhere from about 20 through to 25 degrees of Scorpio, as playing an important part in the evolution of monarchy and the events that happened to monarchy. And in fact, if we go back to 1992, the Queen's Annus Horribilis, then that 22 degrees of Scorpio was very, very prevalent in what was going on at the time. But the other thing to notice with that moon at 0 degrees of Taurus is that was the late Queen's sun. So we have all these references to monarchy, all these references to the continuity of monarchy. They are in this chart. But hey, what did I say? I said that there is concern that he may not be crowned king. Now, why would that be? Back we come to that Neptune sitting on the IC. The whole area around the IC, the very base of the chart, and the 4th house is all about where we've come from. It's our home, our family, and in this case, the dynasty we've come from. So planets in here tell us a big story about that. So there are two things I want to make important here. One of them is the fact that if Neptune is conjoined to your IC, and even if you know you've got Neptune on your IC, and so you're looking at it in your own personal situation, that Neptune is a kind of eroder of confidence. You doubt yourself. So you doubt what you were born to be. Do you see what I mean? It's the axis. That's the life direction axis. It's the role in life on one end, where you come from the other. So it's your heritage. It's your destiny. To have Neptune there says, are you up to the job? You're doubting your lineage. And that's one of the things that I looked at in Charles's case, was this fundamental doubt about himself, he himself. Now, we also know, because we've seen him around for 70 odd years, that he is confident in public life and amusing and dry and warm. But of course, when he was growing up, he was a little awkward, and he, didn't fit comfortably into, he was an old fogey. He was called an old fogey. So again, defining his role for himself has been difficult with that Neptune on his IC. But what else does Neptune on the IC show us? It shows us that the ancestry coming through is one of a Neptunian tone, of a Neptunian note. Now, I like to think of planets and astrology really as a kind of resonance, the music of the spheres, if you like. The planets resonate with us, with each other. When we think of our bloodline and we think about where we come from, and it's taking us back deep into our roots in that fourth house, Neptune conjunct the IC, we get this feeling that sacrifice, all sorts of things that happen that mean giving up of something, of being martyred almost. He's bringing this resonance into his life and his future as king. You might like to think of it as a tuning fork. The horoscope as a tuning fork. It's going to pick up all sorts of resonances from the planets as they are in their orbits round the sun, as well as resonances from the past because of the bloodline that we have. Our genes in our bloodline are resonances in the astrology. We are seeing all this come to life when we look at our horoscope. Admittedly, this is the subject that I should take a lot more time to explain. I'm just giving you a little seasoning here of what my work is, how I believe things are. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on this so much as showing you that the resonance I believed was coming through in this life for Charles, and concerning his destiny was the Duke of Windsor, was King Edward VIII, who abdicated. So let's come back to me again, because I'm going to quickly show you the Duke of Windsor's chart as well. But let me tell you a little bit about Edward VIII. We all know he was a Prince of Wales, and we all know that he gave up the throne for the woman he loved, for Wallis Simpson. And his life thereafter was one of almost superficiality and triviality. He was never reconciled with the royal family. So when Charles was growing up, he was very much under the wing of his uncle, great uncle, I can't remember which one, Dickie Mountbatten, who was or had been a great friend of Edward VIII, the Duke of Windsor. And this influence, because Lord Mountbatten was a huge influence on Charles, I think there was a feeling that there needed to be unity within the family, and it fell upon Charles's shoulders to try to not heal the rift necessarily, but to at least have some kind of connection with his great uncle. And Charles corresponded with Edward VIII, the Duke of Windsor, in his young years, and in 1970 actually went to visit the Duke of Windsor in Paris. It was, to all intents and purposes, a very disappointing meeting of the two, even though, of course, the Duke of Windsor was very keen on building the relationship with Charles, and Charles was keen to become that go-between between the royal family, who wouldn't speak to him at all, and the Duke of Windsor. But in fact, the meeting was a great disappointment, because it was a huge party happening at the time, and Charles was a little bit disillusioned with what he saw. And I think somebody commented, never meet your hero, and it certainly seemed to be in that case. But the reason I'm bringing up Edward VIII is to show you in his chart where I found the connection between him and Charles. So let's have a look at his chart. Now, I think if you look at Edward VIII's chart, the late Duke of Windsor, the life direction axis, the MCIC axis, is a little skew-whipped. It's a little towards the fifth house, but it's still, to all intents and purposes, the life direction axis, MCIC, designates the 10th house cusp and the 4th house cusp. And what you'll see in Edward VIII's chart is Pluto and Neptune, Jupiter as well, actually, close to the IC. Now, in fact, as we know, Edward gave up the throne. He didn't want to give up the throne. He wanted his birthright, but it wasn't compatible with having the woman he loved by his side. So he sacrificed the throne in order to be with Wallis. He, like Charles, had a very difficult childhood. One of the reasons that Charles had a difficult childhood was that although he hero worshipped his own father and loved his mother, because they were always away and on tour, he had a distant relationship with his mother, and he needed that kind of tactile, touchy-feely kind of experience. And the same thing happened with Edward VIII. He had a very difficult relationship with his mother, and actually a difficult relationship with his father as well. So there's a pattern here of sort of not being able to fulfill the role that you really wanted to fulfill. And that's why I'm showing you Edward VIII's chart as well, just so we can see what we're looking at astrologically. So I want to come back now. A little while ago, I talked about the fact that I had put forward the idea in my book that there was a sort of question mark over Charles's destiny. Now, at the time, I wove together a very interesting set of facts, because I believed that the marriage between Charles and Diana was in danger, and that they may well divorce. Of course, this was in 1985, so quite a long time before it happened. And in fact, a long time before I actually met Diana when I was writing this book. Because what I thought was that the marriage posed a problem. He had a Uranus, as we saw with Charles's chart, he's got a Uranus ruled 7th house, and of course Uranus opposed to Jupiter, and the rest of it. And there were a lot of difficult connections between him and Diana. And I thought that perhaps if divorce did happen, that would knock him out of becoming king, because royalty can't have a divorced king on the throne. Well, of course, over the years, that's changed. So in fact, even though Charles and Diana did divorce, it didn't result in his being unable to fulfill his birthright at all. And I want to pop that in there because, we need to look where we astrologers are coming from at the time, why we made certain predictions, and where we are now with them. And we are now really at that point in time where we're looking at the whole unfoldment of all this astrological detail. And although it's taken me quite a time to get here, and I've shown you several charts, it's really almost the tip of the iceberg into how deep you can get this particular period of time. And we're considering the future of the monarchy. We're considering Charles fulfilling his destiny and being crowned. We're looking at the state of the world that we're in right now and thinking, this is turmoil. This is, there are going to be some events here that are going to cast their shadow, really, I think, in terms of this period of the year. And coming back to 1985, when I was writing this book, and I was looking through this lens to the future, and thinking that this may not come about because of a divorce, I think it's important sometimes to stick your neck out as an astrologer and make those predictions, because they're based on your technical knowledge as well as your instinct. So coming up to date now, we're seeing the fulfillment of all of this playing out at this particular point in time, why it's so very important. So to wrap things up, come to the end of this video, where I've taken you through so many rabbit holes, maybe lots of different things that I've shown you. But I think it's something that I said at the end of my Pluto enters Aquarius video, that there's nothing to fear. And I think when I put forward scenarios and describe what's going on, I'm trying to be as realistic as I can, which doesn't mean I'm being negative. It just means I'm being realistic. And even though this is a difficult period for humanity and for us individually, that we shouldn't be looking at these alignments with fear and trepidation. What does it mean? What's going to happen? Oh, this is terrible. So much as we should be looking at them with excitement and anticipation. And in my video on Pluto and Aquarius, I talked about, imagine that you were about to climb Everest, and you were an experienced climber. You know about climbing, so you kitted out all ready to climb Everest. This may be something you always wanted to do, and you were excited about it. There is also a level of fear because it is the unknown. You don't really know what you're going to encounter as you start that big climb up those sheer precipices. And this is really how we should be coming at this period of the year 2023, with some excitement. What does it hold for us? Could this be a period of breakthrough and extraordinary celebration, change, expansion, consciousness, of where all those things? But even if it is turmoil and disturbance, she'll definitely come through it. So hence my recommendation, everybody, be excited, not fearful. The journey lies ahead, and we shall see it all play out in the fullness of time. So thank you for being with me. I hope you've enjoyed it. And as I said it when I began, that I will be going through sign by sign what this configuration means, how this eclipse, and both eclipses, in fact, will play into each of us sign by sign. Bye for now.